The listening station on Europa was quiet that night. Commander Laura sat at her desk and watched the data streams flow across her screen. She had been stationed here for 3 years, monitoring the endless chatter of the galaxy. Most of it was trade negotiations and diplomatic messages between species that barely knew humanity existed. Earth had joined the Galactic Concord 60 years ago, but they were still treated like children at a table full of adults. Lieutenant Daniel was the first to notice the anomaly. He leaned forward in his chair and adjusted his headset. The signal was weak and broken, coming from somewhere far away. He ran it through the translation software and felt his blood turn cold. Laura walked over when she saw his face go pale. She read the words on his screen and her heart began to pound. The message was a distress call from a species called the. They were peaceful traders and scholars who lived in the star system. The message said they were being invaded. The Dominion had arrived with warships and soldiers. Cities were burning. People were dying. They were begging anyone who could hear them to send help. Laura immediately contacted Earth Command. She was connected to Admiral Cole within minutes. The Admiral was an old soldier with gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent his entire career preparing for threats that he hoped would never come. He listened to the distress call and his jaw tightened. The Admiral told Laura to wait while he contacted the Galactic Concord. She spent the next 2 hours packing her small office. When he called back, his voice was heavy with anger. The Concord had voted to abandon the. They said the Dominion was too powerful. They said a rescue mission would cost too many lives. They had calculated the acceptable losses and decided they were not worth saving. Laura felt sick. She asked the Admiral if there was anything humanity could do alone. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her something that only a handful of people on Earth knew. For the past 40 years, humanity had been building a secret fleet. The Galactic Concord believed humans were primitive newcomers with only a few dozen patrol ships. They had no idea what was really hiding in the shadows of Jupiter and Saturn. Earth had learned early that the galaxy was a dangerous place. They had watched stronger species bully weaker ones. They had seen the Concord abandon entire civilizations when the math said it was the smart choice. So humanity had prepared in secret. The Admiral told Laura that Earth had over 400 warships hidden throughout the solar system. They had 12 carrier groups and 50,000 trained Marines. They had weapons that no alien species had ever seen. All of it was built for the day when Earth might need to defend itself against a hostile galaxy. But now the Admiral was thinking about something different. He was thinking about using that fleet not to protect Earth, but to save strangers on the other side of the galaxy. Laura asked him if he was serious. The Admiral said he was. He explained that revealing the fleet would change everything. Every species in the Concord would know that humans had been lying about their strength. Some would be afraid. Some would be angry. Earth would never be seen the same way again. But the Admiral also said that he could not listen to people crying for help and do nothing. He said that was not what humanity was supposed to be. He had not built this fleet so it could sit in the darkness while innocents died. The Admiral ended the call and contacted the Earth government. The debate lasted through the night. Some leaders argued that the risk was too great. Others said that humanity had no obligation to fight for aliens who had never done anything for them. But in the end, the vote was clear. Earth would send the fleet. Earth would save the. The mobilization order went out at dawn. Across the solar system, hidden stations came to life. Warships that had waited decades in darkness powered up their engines. Fighters launched from concealed hangars on moons that the galaxy thought were empty. Troop transports loaded Marines who had trained their whole lives for a battle they never expected to fight. On Earth, alien ambassadors watched in shock as the sky filled with ships. They sent frantic messages to their governments, describing what they were seeing. They reported that the humans had been hiding an armada. They warned that the primitive newcomers were far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. Admiral Cole stood on the bridge of the carrier Endurance and watched his fleet assemble. Captain Grace commanded the ship, and she stood beside him with pride in her eyes. She asked him if he was ready for what came next. The Admiral nodded slowly. He said that humanity had spent 60 years being treated like a minor species. They had been ignored and dismissed and looked down upon. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that somewhere far away, people were suffering. What mattered was that humanity could help them. The fleet formed into battle groups and began moving toward the hyperspace jump point. Laura watched from Europa as hundreds of warships passed overhead. She had never seen anything so beautiful or so terrifying. The Galactic Concord sent urgent messages demanding to know what was happening. Earth responded with a simple statement. Humanity was answering a distress call. Humanity was going to war. The alien ambassadors did not understand. They asked why humans would risk so much for a species they had never met. They asked what humanity hoped to gain from this mission. Admiral Cole heard these questions and smiled sadly. He knew the aliens would never understand. They had evolved on gentle worlds with stable climates and few predators. They had never learned what it meant to struggle for survival. They had never felt the fierce protective instinct that burned in every human heart. Humanity had evolved on a. They had survived ice ages and plagues and predators that wanted to eat them. They had learned to fight for each other because that was the only way to survive. They had built civilizations on the bones of a planet that tried to kill them every single day. And now they were going to show the galaxy what did when they heard someone crying for help. The first ships entered hyperspace and vanished in flashes of light. The rest followed in perfect formation. The greatest armada in human history was on its way to save strangers who had never even heard of Earth. Laura watched until the last ship disappeared. Then she turned back to her station and continued listening, because somewhere out there, someone else might need help, and now the galaxy knew that humanity would answer. The fleet gathered in the darkness between Jupiter and its moons. Captain Grace stood on the bridge of the Endurance and watched the ships arrive one by one. She had served in the Navy for 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this. Carriers and battleships and cruisers stretched across the void in every direction. 400 warships ready for battle. 50,000 Marines ready to fight and die for people they had never met. Admiral Cole walked among his officers and made sure everything was ready. The journey through hyperspace would take 6 days. That was 6 days to prepare for a battle against an enemy they had never faced. 6 days to ready themselves for whatever waited on the other side. Dr. Park was the fleet's and cultural liaison. She had spent her career studying alien species, learning their languages and customs and ways of thinking. Now she had a different job. She had to help the humans understand who they were going to fight and who they were going to save. She briefed the command staff on the second day of the journey. They were a gentle species with soft blue skin and large dark eyes. They had no military. They had never needed one. For thousands of years, they had lived in peace, trading knowledge and art with other civilizations. They believed that violence was the failure of reason. They believed that any conflict could be solved with patience and understanding. The Dominion was the opposite. They were conquerors who had built their empire on the bodies of weaker species. They were tall and powerful, with gray armored skin and 4 arms. They believed that strength was the only law that mattered. They took what they wanted because no one could stop them. Dr. Park explained that the Galactic Concord had abandoned them because they had done the math. They were too strong. The cost of intervention was too high. The Concord always made decisions based on calculations. They measured lives like numbers on a spreadsheet. Captain asked why humans were different. Dr. Park smiled sadly and said it was because humans came from a. Earth had shaped humanity in ways that other species could not understand. Humans had evolved to run toward danger instead of away from it. They had learned to protect strangers because protecting strangers meant protecting the tribe. They had developed something that most alien species lacked: They had developed the instinct to sacrifice themselves for others. Sergeant listened to the briefing from the back of the room. He was the leader of the Marine Strike Team, a veteran of a dozen missions that officially never happened. His face was and his hands were rough, but his eyes were calm. He had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, but he had also seen enough suffering to know that some fights were worth fighting. After the briefing, gathered his Marines in the cargo bay. They were young men and women from every corner of Earth. They had signed up knowing they might never come home. They had trained for years in conditions that would kill most alien species. Now they were about to face their greatest test. Told them what waited on the ground. They had landed thousands of soldiers on Prime. They were capturing civilians and using them as shields. They expected the humans to bomb from orbit or negotiate from a distance. They did not expect anyone to actually come down and fight them face to face. Said the Marines were going to prove them wrong. They were going to land on that planet and rescue every single person they could find. They were going to show the what could do, and they were going to show that they were not alone in the universe. The Marines cheered and began checking their weapons, walked among them and felt proud of every single one. They knew the odds. They knew that some of them would not survive, but they were going anyway because that was what humans did. On the third day, the fleet received updated intelligence from probes that had been sent ahead. The news was bad. They had brought over 200 warships to the system. They had established a complete blockade around the planet. Their ground forces had already captured most of the major cities. Millions were being held prisoner. Admiral Cole studied the reports and began planning the attack. They had superior numbers, but humans had advantages that could not be measured in ship counts. Human reflexes were faster than almost any other species. Human bodies could survive acceleration forces that would kill most aliens. Human pilots could make decisions in split seconds that computers needed minutes to process. And humans had something else. They had the willingness to take risks that other species would consider insane. They would fly into certain death if it meant saving innocent lives. They would sacrifice themselves without hesitation if it meant protecting others. Captain received her orders on the fourth day. The Endurance would lead the main assault on the fleet. Her pilots would punch through the defensive line and target the enemy command ships. It was the most dangerous assignment in the battle plan. She accepted without hesitation. On the fifth day, the fleet prepared for the final jump. Marines loaded into drop pods. Pilots climbed into their fighters. Gunners powered up weapons that had never been fired in anger. Everyone wrote letters home, just in case. Dr. Park sat alone in her quarters and thought about what was coming. She had studied war her entire life, but she had never actually seen one. She wondered if she was ready. Then she thought about the children hiding in ruins while monsters hunted them. She decided that being ready did not matter. What mattered was showing up. On the sixth day, the fleet exited hyperspace at the edge of the system. Sensors lit up with contacts. The Armada was waiting exactly where intelligence had predicted. 200 warships bristling with weapons, confident that nothing in the galaxy could challenge them. Admiral Cole opened a channel to the entire fleet. He told them that today they would make history. Today they would show the galaxy what humanity truly was. Today they would fight for people who had never done anything for them, simply because it was the right thing to do. He said that some of them would not survive. He said that was the price of doing what was right. But he promised that their sacrifice would mean something. He promised that the galaxy would never forget what humans did here today. Then he gave the order to advance. 400 human warships began moving toward the defensive line. The greatest battle in human history was about to begin. Admiral Cole stood on the bridge of the Endurance and watched the fleet grow larger on the main screen. 200 enemy warships hung in space around Prime like a wall of metal and death. They were confident. They were powerful. They had no idea what was coming. The admiral opened a communication channel to the command ship. He spoke slowly and clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. He demanded the immediate withdrawal of all forces from the system. He demanded the release of all prisoners. He gave them 1 hour to comply. The response came from Supreme Commander himself. The leader appeared on screen with contempt in his yellow eyes. He was tall and broad, with gray armored skin that gleamed under the lights of his bridge. His 4 arms were folded across his chest. Laughed at the human demands. He said that humanity was new to the galactic stage. He said they were primitive creatures from a small planet who did not understand how the universe worked. He said the strong took what they wanted and the weak accepted their fate. That was the natural order. That was the only law that mattered. Admiral Cole listened patiently until finished speaking. Then he said something simple. He said they had 1 hour. He said humanity hoped they would use that time wisely. Then he closed the channel. The hour passed slowly. Human ships moved into attack formation. Pilots ran final checks on their fighters. Marines secured themselves in drop pods and waited for the order to launch. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone was ready. They did nothing. They sat in their positions and waited, certain that the humans were bluffing. They had conquered dozens of species. They had never met anyone foolish enough to challenge them directly. They assumed the humans would negotiate or retreat when they realized the odds against them. When the hour ended, Admiral Cole gave a single order: attack. The human fleet surged forward like a wave of fire and steel. Fighters launched from carrier bays in swarms so thick they blotted out the stars. Missiles streaked across the void toward ships that were only now beginning to realize their mistake. Flight Leader Torres led his squadron straight at the enemy defensive line. He was a young pilot with quick hands and no fear. He had trained for this moment his entire life. His fighters were faster and more agile than anything they had ever faced. They danced through enemy fire like ghosts. The first ships exploded within minutes of the battle starting. Human weapons were not more powerful than weapons. Human ships were not stronger than ships, but human pilots were faster. Human gunners were more accurate. Human captains made decisions that computers could not predict. Supreme Commander watched the battle unfold with growing horror. His tactical algorithms were failing. They were designed to predict enemy movements based on rational self-interest. They could not account for pilots who flew directly into enemy fire to protect their. They could not understand captains who sacrificed their own ships to create openings for others. They fought back with everything they had. They outnumbered the humans and their weapons were deadly. Human ships began to die. Fighters vanished in balls of flame. Cruisers broke apart under concentrated fire. But for every human ship that fell, 3 ships went down with it. Captain commanded the Endurance through the heart of the battle. Her ship took hit after hit, but she refused to retreat. She pushed forward toward the command ships, knowing that cutting off the head would end the fight faster. Torres and his squadron reached the enemy flagship. They dodged defensive fire and launched everything they had at the ship's engines. The explosions tore through the vessel and sent it spinning out of control. Supreme Commander barely escaped to a secondary ship before his flagship broke apart. The battle raged for 6 hours, 6 hours of fire and death and desperate courage. Human losses mounted with every passing minute, but losses mounted faster. They were relentless. They did not stop. They did not surrender. They fought with a fury that they had never encountered. By the end of the 6th hour, the fleet was broken. Over 150 enemy ships had been destroyed or disabled. The survivors were retreating to the edge of the system, trying to regroup and escape. The blockade around Prime had collapsed. Admiral Cole allowed himself a moment of relief. Then he remembered that the battle was only half won. They still had thousands of soldiers on the ground. They still had millions of prisoners. The space battle had been costly, but the ground war would be worse. He contacted Sergeant and gave the order to begin the planetary assault. Drop pods launched from every ship in the fleet, falling toward the surface like metal rain. Each pod carried Marines who knew they were descending into hell. Each Marine had accepted that they might not come back. On the surface of Prime, they looked up at the sky and saw the pods falling. They did not understand what was happening. They did not know who these strangers were or why they had come. They had sent their distress call without hope, never expecting anyone to answer. But someone had answered. Someone had crossed the galaxy to save them. Someone was willing to die for people they had never met. The first drop pods hit the ground outside the capital city of. Marines emerged with weapons ready, already taking fire from defensive positions. The ground war had begun. Admiral Cole watched from orbit and said a quiet prayer for his people down below. He had done everything he could to give them a chance. Now it was up to them to finish what humanity had started. The galaxy was watching. The galaxy would never be the same. Sergeant hit the ground running. His drop pod had landed in a park that was now a crater filled with burning trees and shattered stone. Enemy fire was coming from 3 directions. His Marines were already shooting back. The city of stretched out before him in ruins. Beautiful towers had been reduced to rubble. Gardens that had taken centuries to grow were nothing but ash. And somewhere in that destruction, millions were waiting to be rescued. Gathered his squad and began moving toward the nearest civilian shelter. Intelligence said they were holding thousands of prisoners in the old government district. That was the primary target, but knew they would find survivors along the way. He had orders to save everyone they could, no matter how long it took. Corporal stayed close behind him. She was the squad's combat medic, a small woman with steady hands and fierce determination. She carried enough medical supplies to treat 100 casualties. She suspected she would need every bit of it before the day was done. The first soldiers appeared at the end of a ruined street. They were huge, towering over the humans by nearly a meter. Their gray armored skin deflected small arms fire. Their 4 arms each held a different weapon. They moved with the confidence of warriors who had never lost a battle. Raised his rifle and fired 3 shots. 2 hit the lead in the neck, the only weak point in their natural armor. The alien dropped. The others scattered for cover. The firefight lasted 10 minutes. 3 Marines were wounded. 12 were killed. It was the first of many battles that day. They found their first survivors in the basement of a collapsed building. 20 huddled together in the darkness, terrified and starving. They had been hiding for 3 days, listening to the sounds of death above them. When they saw the humans, they did not know whether to feel hope or fear. Moved among them, checking for injuries and distributing food and water. She spoke softly even though they could not understand her words. Her tone was enough. Her gentleness was enough. They began to relax. They began to believe they might actually survive. Left to escort the survivors to an extraction point. Then he pushed forward with the rest of his squad. There were more people to save. There was no time to rest. The battle raged across the entire city. Human Marines fought through streets and buildings and tunnels. They had fortified every intersection and every plaza. They had expected the humans to bomb from orbit, to stay safe in space and negotiate from a distance. They had not expected anyone to come down and fight them face to face. But humans were. They did not fight from a distance when innocent lives were at stake. They went in personally. They bled personally. They died personally. Elder watched the battle from the ruins of his council chamber. He was the leader of an old man who had spent his life believing in peace and diplomacy. He had sent the distress call knowing that no one would answer. He had prepared himself to watch his people die. Now strangers were dying for them instead. He could not understand it. The humans had nothing to gain from this war. They had no resources that Earth needed. They had no strategic value. They were simply people who had asked for help, and somehow, impossibly, someone had answered. A human squad reached his position late in the afternoon. Himself led them through the rubble to the chamber where waited. The old looked at the sergeant with wonder in his large, dark eyes. Asked why the humans had come, paused and thought about the question. Then he said something simple. He said they had come because they heard the distress call. He said humanity could not listen to people crying for help and do nothing. Said his people had nothing to offer in return. They could not pay the humans. They could not help them in future wars. They were scholars and artists, not warriors. Smiled and said that did not matter. He said humans did not help others because they expected something in return. They helped because it was the right thing to do. That was what it meant to be human. The commander on the ground was growing desperate. His forces were being pushed back on every front. He had thousands of hostages, and he decided to use them. He announced that he would begin executing prisoners unless the humans immediately received the message and felt cold rage settle into his bones. He contacted Captain in orbit and requested permission to attempt a rescue. She approved without hesitation. The hostages were being held in a stadium on the eastern edge of the city. Over 5,000 were crowded onto the field, surrounded by soldiers with weapons aimed at their heads. The commander had given the humans 1 hour to retreat. He was confident they would comply. No rational species would risk so many lives. And his Marines reached the stadium with 20 minutes to spare. They studied the defenses and counted the guards. The odds were bad. The chances of success were low. Many of them would probably die. They attacked anyway. The assault was brutal and fast. Marines came over the walls and through the gates and from beneath the ground. They hit from every direction at once, overwhelming them with speed and fury. Ran onto the field and began treating wounded civilians even while bullets flew around her. The commander tried to give the execution order. He never finished the sentence. Put 3 rounds through his head from 50 meters away. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 43 Marines were dead or wounded, but 5,000 were free. Arrived at the stadium as the last fighting ended. He walked among the survivors and saw human medics treating wounded. He saw Marines standing guard over children, protecting them with their own bodies. He saw people who had traveled across the galaxy to die for strangers. He finally understood what the humans meant when they called themselves. It was not about strength or violence. It was about the willingness to sacrifice everything for others. It was about running toward danger instead of away from it. The resistance collapsed over the next 2 days. Soldiers surrendered rather than face more human Marines. The last pockets of fighting ended quietly. The battle for Prime was over. Stood in the ruins of and watched the sun set over a broken but free city. His people had paid a heavy price, but they had saved millions of lives. They had proven that humanity was not just another species trying to survive in a dangerous galaxy. They had proven that could be heroes. The weeks after the battle were filled with hard work and healing. Human ships remained in orbit around Prime, providing supplies and medical care and protection. Engineers helped rebuild power stations and water systems. Doctors treated wounds that medicine could not handle. Soldiers who had fought as warriors now worked as construction crews. Admiral Cole walked through the streets of and saw his people everywhere. They were handing out food to hungry families. They were playing with children who had lost their parents. They were teaching engineers how to repair human equipment. The war was over, but the mission continued. Dr. Park spent her days translating and explaining. They had 1,000 questions about humanity. They wanted to know about Earth and its history. They wanted to know why humans had evolved to be so different from other species. They wanted to understand the strange creatures who had crossed the galaxy to save them. Park told them She told them about ice ages and plagues and predators. She told them about millions of years of struggle that had forged humanity into something unique. She told them that humans protected strangers because protecting strangers was how they had survived. They listened with wonder. They had always believed that violence was a failure of reason. Now they were learning that sometimes violence was an expression of love. Sometimes the greatest kindness was the willingness to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. On Earth, Ambassador prepared for the most important speech of her life. The Galactic Concord had called an emergency session to discuss what humanity had done. Every species in the galaxy would be watching. Every word she spoke would shape how aliens viewed humanity for generations to come. She stood before the Concord chamber and looked out at hundreds of alien representatives. Some watched her with fear. Some watched with anger. Some watched with something that might have been hope. Spoke clearly and calmly. She acknowledged that humanity had hidden its true military strength from the galaxy. She admitted that this deception had broken trust, but she said that humanity had chosen to reveal itself not through conquest or threat, but through an act of mercy. She said they had sent a distress call. She said the conquered had voted to abandon them. She said humanity had decided that abandoning innocent people was not acceptable, no matter what the calculations said. Some of the alien representatives protested. They said humanity had violated conquered protocols. They said the deception about the fleet was unforgivable. They demanded sanctions and restrictions and punishment. Then Elder rose to speak. The old walked slowly to the center of the chamber. His robes were torn and stained from the war. His eyes were tired but clear. He looked around at the species that had voted to let his people die. He told them what he had seen. He told them about human soldiers fighting through streets filled with death to rescue strangers. He told them about medics treating wounded while bullets flew around them. He told them about Marines who died protecting children they had never met. He said the humans had lost over 3,000 soldiers in the battle, 3,000 young men and women who would never go home. They had paid that price for people they owed nothing to. They had paid it because they believed that some things were more important than survival. Declared that they would forever stand with humanity. He said they would be allies and friends until the stars themselves went dark. He said any species that threatened Earth would face thee as well. The chamber fell silent. Then other representatives began to rise. Species that had watched the battle from afar came forward one by one. They offered their support. They offered their friendship. They said they had been wrong about humanity. They said they wanted to be allies of the. Not every species agreed. Some still feared what humanity represented. Some still resented the deception. But the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted. Humanity was no longer a minor species to be ignored. They were something new. They were protectors. The Dominion issued threats of revenge. They promised to destroy Earth for what had been done. But intelligence reports suggested they were quietly reconsidering their expansion plans. They had expected easy conquest. They had not expected. Admiral Cole attended a ceremony on Prime before the fleet departed for home. They had built a memorial for the humans who had died in their defense. 3,000 names were carved into a wall of white stone that gleamed in the sunlight. The admiral stood before the wall and read the names silently. He had known some of these people. He had sent all of them to fight. Their deaths weighed on his soul like stones. Captain found him there as the sun began to set. She stood beside him and said nothing for a long time. Then she said that the dead would have been proud of what they accomplished. Cole nodded slowly. He said that humanity had spent its entire existence fighting to survive on a world that tried to kill them. Now they had proven they could do more than survive. They could protect others. They could be heroes. He said he hoped the galaxy would remember this day. He hoped other species would learn that strength and compassion could exist together. He hoped humanity would never forget what it meant to be. The fleet departed for Earth the next morning. Ships that had arrived as instruments of war left as symbols of hope. The galaxy watched them go and wondered what would come next. On Europa, Commander Laura sat at her station and monitored the endless chatter of the stars. 3 months had passed since she had first received the distress call. Everything had changed since then. Everything was different now. A new signal appeared on her screen. It was weak and broken, coming from the far edge of known space. Another species was calling for help. Another civilization was facing destruction. Laura smiled and began preparing the alert for Earth Command. The galaxy was vast and dangerous and filled with predators, but it also had protectors now. It had who ran toward danger instead of away from it. It had humanity. The message went out across the solar system. Ships began to stir in their hidden stations. Marines checked their weapons and prepared for another mission. Admiral Cole read the report and began planning the response. Somewhere far away, strangers were crying for help, and humanity was going to answer, because that was what did. That was what it meant to be human. The galaxy had spent centuries believing that we're monsters to be feared. They had never imagined that the most dangerous species in existence would become their greatest hope. They had never understood that humans did not fight because they loved war. Humans fought because they could not bear to hear someone suffering and do nothing. And now, across 1,000 worlds, species who had once trembled at the word were learning to hope when they heard it instead.